Welcome to our panel discussion today. Over the next 45 minutes or so, our panel will be discussing the latest news around CMMC, what it might mean for you and your company, and how best to prioritize your cyber risk efforts. My name is Peter Chase, and I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Hyperproof. Hyperproof provides a technology platform. It's really designed to enable companies to better manage their compliance efforts in a world where we're seeing is increasingly complex and where maintaining trust with your stakeholders, including state and federal governments, is of paramount importance today. So to get started, what I'm going to do is introduce our panel. At Hyperproof, we're fortunate to have a number of great partners and work with a number of top experts in the world of IT risk and compliance. And I'm happy to introduce three of the best and the brightest that we work with. So, but I'm going to let each panel introduce themselves first. I'd like to start with Wilson Bautista from June Cyber. Wilson, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hi, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Wilson Bautista. I'm the CEO of June Cyber. I'm a retired military officer with over 17 years of experience in the military, doing a lot of Department of Defense contracting work with the U.S. Marine Corps, as well as with Missile Defense Agency. I own my own consulting firm, and we do managed services, and a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Wilson. Next, we have Kate Upton. She's the government compliance leader from OCD Tech. Kate.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Kate, and I work for a consulting firm, an IT audit and assurance firm called OCD Tech. We're in the Boston area, and I spend my day helping folks be in compliance with lots of their government needs. So mainly that ends up in the NIST 800-171, the DFAR space, and I spend my day, helping folks put together their compliance programs, whether that's through SSP and POAM creation, or trying to figure out where their CUI is and how to label it.
Great, Kate. Thanks. And finally, we have Jeff Roberts.
Hey, folks. Glad to be here today. Looking forward to having a great chat. My name is Jeff Roberts. I'm the co-founder of principiaRAID. We are a cybersecurity group focused on response, assurance and compliance, information security and design, with a specific focus in the compliance space, helping contractors in the defense supply chain and the defense industrial base achieve and maintain their specific compliance requirements. I come out of a 20-year background in the aerospace and defense industry, where I worked for a multinational global aerospace contractor with contracts in multiple countries, managing IT strategy and implementation across sectors, countries, IT teams. Buried in ISO 27001, DFARS, CMMC, ITAR, all the bruises. So really looking forward to having this conversation today. We've got a great group.
Thanks, Jeff. I see we're going to be using a few acronyms today. So
yes,
I guess when you're in the government world, you do. So exciting. So let's jump right in. Let's start with our first question. The thing that's on, question that's on everybody's mind these days. What do all the changes that are coming out of the DoD and the CMMC AB mean? We had quite a crazy week last week with announcements. But what does it mean for the defense industrial base? So I'll start with Jeff. Bring it back to you, Jeff. Any thoughts on these announcements and what it means?
Yeah, lots, Peter, and I'll try to keep it very high level. But basically, to safeguard sensitive national security information, the DoD has launched CMMC 2.0, which is an evolution of the previous CMMC 1.0. And they've launched that in response to a combination of concerns and evolution in the requirements, and frankly, feedback from the defense industrial base. A lot of feedback from small and medium businesses concerned about the bureaucracy and red tape and cost of achieving compliance. So the DoD has now launched version 2.0, which they're calling a streamlined model, to basically focus on the most critical requirements, moving from what was 5 previous compliance levels to a new framework with 3 compliance levels that are very closely aligned with accepted standards. In effect, the main level that we expect many companies to be required to achieve is level 2, and that level is now aligned pretty much exactly with the NIST SP 800-171 practices. There are some changes in the spirit of how this needs to be implemented, moving from a previous requirement for mandated third-party assessment to now splitting that requirement so that some businesses with higher levels of more sensitive data will still have a mandated assessment by a certified assessor as a requirement. But many of the companies that expressed concern in the small to medium space will potentially now be able to self-assess against NIST 800-171 for a level 2 framework. And probably the other biggest change, I know we'll get into some of this discussion, is in the initial CMMC framework, POAMs became a thing of the past. You were either compliant or you were not. And this idea that you had a plan that you were working to achieve compliance was not going to be acceptable. That is now back in scope, and companies will be able to, again, potentially depending on their level and the type of sensitive data they're holding, they may be able to very well say, we are not entirely compliant, but here is our POAM, here's our plan of action and milestones that we're working to reach that targeted level of compliance, and here's how long we think it's going to take. So in high level, more flexible, potentially less onerous and costly for a large group of businesses who were very concerned, and definitely higher accountability potentially, but we'll get into that in a later point.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Wilson, do you have any thoughts or things you want to add to the?
Yeah, I think that all of us were pretty surprised, but also not surprised that there was going to be some changes with the CMMC 2.0. But one of the things that I was really taken aback a little bit is that there's going to be a minimum threshold for SPRS scores for businesses to do with government. And I mean, that wasn't like that before. And I think we're going to get into this a little bit later. But what does that mean? The DoD hasn't come out with a particular SPRS score just yet, but we know that it's a huge spread. I would say that if we were going to look at what the minimum would be, is looking at the level 1 controls, those 17 controls, and making sure that those are good to go, because that's what everybody needs to do. And then we start looking at what they're calling the heavily weighted controls. And I think that's something that Kate could probably talk a little bit more to. Kate, can you maybe talk about the POAMs and on the restrictions on the highly weighted controls? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
You guys were like, you got to mute so you're not being distracting, and then I don't even say that I'm muted. Thanks. So I think that the allowance for POAMs is one of the more significant wins for industry as a whole with the CMMC 2.0 changes. So like you said, so under CMMC 2.0, there is an allowance for POAMs at the time of contract award. So organizations will have 180 days after contract award to remediate the remaining items on their POAM, with the caveat that none of the highest weighted controls may be on that POAM. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the NIST 800-171 framework assigns a numerical point value to each one of the controls. So that value can be 1, 3, or 5. And, as we understand CMMC 2.0 right now, this means that none of the controls weighted at 5 points may be on your POAM at the time of award. So for many organizations, this might guide how they prioritize their remediation activities. Before organizations, in my experience, often aim for the sort of low-hanging fruit, right? So those controls that are cheap or lower effort to remediate, to do those first. And now I think organizations will likely look to prioritize the controls valued at 5 points to try to knock those off to begin with.
Great. Anything else from this pronouncement that anybody wants to opine on before we move on to the next question? Great. The next question really relates to, okay, in light of these new developments, what should companies do? How should you proceed? What should you do now? What should you wait and see on, because there's still some ambiguity? Maybe you could provide some color on that. I'll start. Wilson, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we all know that CMMC 1.0 is now different than CMMC 2.0 in the different respects. So we need to make sure that we continue to understand what that means. And I would say if you're not already on the town hall subscription list, to make sure that you're on the town hall subscription list. Another thing that I would also recommend is that if you have somebody that's on your IT team, make sure that they go through the certified CMMC professional training. It's out now. There's really no excuse, right? So it's like let's get folks trained, and so that you're not always depending on some external source. You have an external source that supports what your internal source already knows. So try to get somebody on your team to go through that certified CMMC professional training. For those that are already familiar with CMMC 1.0, just understand some of the major changes, make sure that you're constantly informed, but also make sure that you get information from the right sources, from the AB. And then as we're going through this next iteration, this next evolution with CMMC, we have self-attestation, which to me, I believe it could be a blessing or it could be a curse, right? And we talk about like the False Claims Act. We need to make sure that we're doing right by the government and we're doing right by our organizations to make sure that we're staying compliant and that we're keeping our organization safe, but also that we're reporting what our actual status is. So if we don't report what we're actually supposed to be doing, then we're going to get in trouble, and that impacts all of us.
I understood from at least, and I'm not sure if this is new, but I understand that as part of the self-attestation process, that the executives of the company need to sign off on that and attest to the attestation. I guess. Any thoughts on that? Is that a new requirement or new? Or does that elevate anything at all? Do you think?
Like for me, I think that requirement itself, with like ISO 27701, that's an automatic requirement that you have to have top level attestation that you're going to follow a system. Mm-hmm. So this is no different. They want to make sure that the head of every organization understands their responsibility to cybersecurity, to themselves as well as the government.
Great. And I guess I'll go to you, Kate. Any thoughts in terms of what companies should do now, what they should wait and see on?
Absolutely, yeah. So like Wilson said, you should really familiarize yourself with CMMC 2.0. So gain an understanding and familiarity with what's changed and what's not changed. So the things you've already done that you can continue to build on. So one thing I would do right now is update your documentation. So I would archive the current SSP, the current poem that you have. Don't delete it, but make a copy of it and strip out those 20 CMMC 1.0 exclusive controls, strip out the process maturity, and make sure that it reflects NIST 800-171. And this will both align you with your obligations as they stand right now, and reduce any confusion for what you're on the hook for on the horizon. I would continue to work towards compliance for sure. I've heard that a lot. Like, so do these changes mean I get to pump the brakes? No, I would say no. No matter where CMMC is headed, if DFAR 7012 is in your contract today, you're on the hook for compliance with NIST 800-171. And the other parts of the DFARS clause. So by all accounts, you're compelled to meet your contractual obligations. And I know that these changes to the CMMC program can dissuade organizations from wanting to make investments in things that might not exist later. But I can tell you this: it's the federal standard to protect CUI using NIST 800-171 in non-federal systems. So that would take a federal level change in course to change that. So like any federal baseline, the DoD can choose to add to the requirement. They can make the hurdles higher. They can make it harder to achieve, which is what they did with CMMC 1.0, but it can never reduce the standard. So all organizations can rest assured that working towards compliance with NIST 800-171 will never be a bad investment. And I've gotten a lot of questions from folks that I know clients, a lot of them want to know whether the changes in CMMC means that they no longer need Microsoft GCC or GCC High. And the answer to that is yes, you still need it, but not because of the NIST or the CMMC frameworks, but because of the DFAR 7012 clause. So under that, organizations are compelled to protect CUI when it's in a cloud environment using a product that at least aligns with FedRAMP moderate baseline. So an organization could use GCC High, they could use AWS GovCloud or Prevail or any of those products. But the answer of the theme is definitely yes. You still need to protect CUI in the cloud with at least FedRAMP moderate baseline. And those requirements are totally separate of NIST 800, 171 and CMMC. So it's also important to have an understanding of what you're on the hook for right now and continue to comply with those obligations.
One of the questions I've heard has come up quite a bit is the plans themselves, the controls, the security plan, that kind of thing. What how should that be treated? Is that what elements of that should be treated at the same level of CUI? Is there clarity on that question?
Whether you should treat your system security plan as CUI?
And other information that's relevant to your
Right.
compliance with 800.
So that information can't be CUI
Right.
ever. And the reason for that is that the government owns CUI. So if you, CUI is government owned information.
Right.
So if you have information that you did not create under a DFAR 7012 contract, you've not created it on behalf of the government, that's yours, which means it's proprietary information. And it means that you should protect it how you see fit. I will say that your SSP and your POAM is basically a guide to everything you're doing and you're not doing. So I would protect that. I would encrypt that. I would not share that. So if you have a prime and they say, hey, I want to see your SSP, hey, I want to see your POAM, I would say no. Here's my score. I can tell you that I'm in compliance. Here's attestation, but I'm not giving you a path to my vulnerabilities. So you definitely want to protect that information.
But the government doesn't have any position on that other than...
They don't have a position on it. And in my opinion, they shouldn't because it's not theirs to worry about.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thanks, Kate. That's the question I've heard before. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on what you should be doing now?
I do, yeah. Thanks, Peter. And a couple of really good points to reinforce, actually, from both Wilson and Kate. Wilson's comment about the attestation and the sign-off is terribly relevant. There's been, as you can imagine, a host of reaction in the marketplace to the changes that the DoD have now announced. And some people are concerned that the program has lost its teeth with the removal of the third-party mandated assessment. In my opinion, I think it was a great move to enforce self-attestation sign-off by the senior level executives of the company actually signing off to say, hey, this is our score. I'm now compelled to take responsibility that what I'm telling you is legitimate. So I think that puts some teeth back into it. Similarly to a financial audit where, the CEO or the CFO is personally taking responsibility for the validity of the information. I think that's huge. And to Kate's point, around, POAMs and progress, I think, and I can tell you what we've seen in across our entire customer base, frankly, is not enough focus on what companies' existing requirements are today, right? So there's lots of people worrying about, here's CMMC, there's still some to be determined details, there's still a timeline, there's still when are the rules going to be announced. Companies need to be focused on their existing requirements under the DFARS clauses that are already in their contracts. There are a host of companies throughout the entirety of the defense supply chain that are potentially not as compliant as they should be, and frankly aren't giving enough focus to what they're contractually obligated to be already doing. So there's a host of other feedback Ecstatic that CMMC Level 2 is now aligned pretty much directly with NIST 800-171 because that provides the core of cybersecurity best practices. If there was no such thing as CMMC, if Kate was specifically wrong and the government is going to back out all of their requirements, which is never going to happen. That's never going away. NIST 800-171 is still the right thing to do. So that's that's a rabbit hole we could spend the whole call going down, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here that I think are relevant that we can take now instead of waiting to the end. So I'm gonna pose them. The first question is regarding a major concern expressed in reference to the change to 2.0 was evaluation and in quotes cost. Is there an estimated cost anywhere in the CMMC ecosystem other than a blanket statement referring to in quotes market forces? Does anybody have any?
No, there's not. There's not. So there was data associated with CMMC 1.0 to tell folks what to expect. And those, I don't know that I agree with it or I disagree with it. Actually, I do. I disagree with it. I think that they lowballed it a little bit. I think that they led people to believe that it wasn't going to be quite as expensive to implement as it is. And I think the reason for that is because NIST 800-171 has been good law for so long. So when the DoD wrote up those numbers and those projections and said, this is what we think it's going to take you to get from point A to point B, they're assuming that your organization has already implemented NIST 800-171. When in reality, because they weren't checking up on people and they weren't enforcing that requirement, a lot of folks were starting from scratch. So no, I haven't seen any figures that are exclusively associated with CMMC 2.0. But as the DoD gives out figures on these types of things, that's really important to remember is that their starting point is assuming that you are compliant with NIST 800-171.
Oh, that's interesting. And then any other thoughts on that before I go to the next question?
Yeah,
Sorry, Wilson, go ahead.
I have to agree. I have to agree with Kate. It's they assume that everybody is already doing what they were supposed to do with 800-171, and that all the capabilities are already there. But we know, us that are doing this, is that it's not quite like that. And the cost also associates itself with how complex your environment is. Obviously, smaller companies are not going to spend as much money as larger companies that have a more complex environment. We're seeing that now with a lot of these big companies, multinational companies that are trying to figure out how do I isolate my CUI. For like small companies that just do defense contracting business, it's really easy just to put everything in scope. But for these large businesses, they're spending and they're investing a lot of money to make sure that they could prove to the government that CUI is isolated and contained. That's all I have. Thanks.
Right.
Yeah, just to add to that, Peter, again, agreed completely. I think many of the companies that have been concerned about the exceedingly high costs to be compliant fall directly into the space of already not doing what they're supposed to have been doing. So when we engage with customers and we're doing an assessment and we find out what their delta really is, the majority of cost is related to bringing them up to compliance with what they're already supposed to be doing, not anything additional to get them towards CMMC.
Okay. No, that's certainly interesting. There was another question from the audience that I'd like to just pose while we're on this topic, and I'll read it. Can you talk to the so-called, in quotes, hidden requirements, such as the need for domain specific policies, et cetera, that aren't included in the actual NIST controls, but still implicated by the DFARS clauses? Anybody want to take that one?
Sure. I'll quickly. So in CMMC 2.0, there were a host of controls that were stripped out effectively, and many of those controls were related to proving that you have policy, procedure, and standards documentation across a host of categories. I think the delta here is that while those have been removed and may potentially no longer be actually assessed, you can't effectively implement an access control set of technical controls if you don't have an access control policy that defines what those controls look like. So while technically I think there are a host of things that won't actually be assessed, you still need to have the basic set of policies, procedures, and standards to actually function as a mature and secure organization. The concept that, we don't have to do these things, no, absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. You still have to do them. There's now some flexibility into what levels of evaluation and assessment you might be weighed against, but you still need those core policies, even though they're not technically included in the framework. Kate, would you agree with that one? I know that's near and dear to your heart.
Yes. If you look in the NIST 800-171 alpha, so NIST 100-171A, which is the assessment guide, it actually lists a bunch of policies and procedures that NIST say are sort of, like these are what you need to be able to make all of these controls happen. And that list of policies, that includes an access control policy, that includes an incident response policy. So if you remove CMMC from it, you're just looking at NIST 800-171, the folks that read that knew that. They knew exactly what Jeff just said, that you can't implement these controls without some kind of policy or procedure that governs it. You need that governance. So absolutely true.
Great. I think what I'll do is move on to, before we move on to our next question, one of the things that might be on some folks in the audience's mind is with 2.0, I know and Lynn, you might want to pull up the slide with the 2.0 versus 1.0 slide that was on there. But could anybody talk to, what it means, who really needs to, how do I evaluate what I really am required to do under this new CMMC model 2.0? Somebody wants to
so if you have a government contract, but you don't have CUI, if you don't have controlled unclassified information, which I could talk about all day, but I won't, there are a few different ways you can have it. And a lot of people think that the only way you can have CUI is if through your contracting officer or the government has handed you CUI, has handed you a piece of paper that says CUI on it. And that's not always true. You could start out a contract and not receive any and be exclusively creating it from scratch yourself under that government contract. So the first thing you need to understand to even begin this process of figuring out which one you're on the hook for is if you have CUI. So if you've received it from your prime, if you've received it from the government, sure, or if you're creating it yourself. So those are very important things that you need to know, because if the answer is no, then you're level 1, which is federal contract information, which is information you can obtain under that government contract that doesn't rise to the level of CUI. It just doesn't need to be protected in the same way. If you do have CUI, you'll be level 2 or level 3. The DoD hasn't expanded on level 3 much about who they expect to get it. We can expect, and this is just Kate's opinion, that it will be the biggest. It will be the Raytheons. It will be General Dynamics. It will be the biggest ones out there. I don't see any sort of medium, definitely no medium or small size businesses will be level 3. So I would, if you have CUI, whether you're small, medium, or large, you're at least level 2.
Great. No, that's helpful. There's another question from the audience that and the reason I think it's really interesting is that in a lot of ways, this is what the 3 organizations that are represented by our panelists do, is either help companies become compliant or get their house in order, or do attestation, or both. And the question is, I know a senior company official has to sign off on the self-attestation, but can I still engage a third party to prepare my self-assessment if I don't have the cycles or resources or even the necessary skills to do it?
Yes, and you should. So if I write you, if I create and this is true for any audit, right? So this is true if somebody prepares an ISO for you or a SOC 2 or whatever. If I present that to you, I'm going to present it with an executive summary. That executive summary is going to tell you all of my findings. Here's what's good. Here's what's bad. Here's what's ugly. Here are the things that you need to take action on. So the executive summary will say, so what? right? So if you read that and you have confidence in me as the person who prepared it for you, you can write an attestation that says, hey, to the best of my ability, I know that my company is compliant, and we had this third party come in and assess us. You can say that too if you want to, but absolutely you can. And that's something I sort of think will come up later, is figuring out if you're someone that can do it yourself, or if you're an organization that can't. And there's no shame in that. There's no shame if you're like, we don't have the bandwidth for that, because that's what I do all day, is I prepare SSPs and poems and CUI programs, and that takes me 40 to 50 hours a week, and I'm not responsible for access control. I'm not responsible for implementing. So it's a big bite. So if you need help, you should absolutely ask for it.
I would jump right in and concur with that one. That falls into the preaching to the choir, Peter. And frankly, I'd take it even a bit further. The majority of what companies like ours in this space are doing, at least my perspective on that today, is qualified gap assessments to provide a level of expertise in actually understanding where you think you might be versus where you really are. But when I say I'd go further than that, I think there are a host of companies, and I'm, coming out of 20 years in the defense supply chain, from manufacturing companies as small as 50 to, facilities with 1,500 employees doing major contract work for all the major primes. I can tell you that the GM of any of those businesses is going to potentially find a significant delta between what he thinks his compliance is and what it actually is. And this is by no means a pitch, but get a second opinion. Doesn't matter whose opinion it is. Ideally, get someone who's qualified to give it to you. But it's highly advisable to have an independent, if you have the skills in-house to do it. But get that second opinion to validate what your in-house team is telling you, especially now that you have to sign off on being potentially liable and responsible for the results. I think it's critical. There's so many deltas between perceived compliance and actual risk. And, we fix messes all the time. We'd rather help people prevent them from happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add on here is that, yes, it's really great to have somebody to come in and do that gap assessment. It's another thing to make sure that you're holding your implementers that are supposed to fill those gaps accountable as well. And something that we haven't talked about yet is like, how do MSSPs and how do MSPs fit into this? Because they also they are also part of the CUI equation when it comes to the architecture and how you're protecting your data. You're going to have to bring them in, and they're going to have to be part of that gap assessment as well. Any thoughts on that, Kate? Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I would agree with both of you. I think it's very important. I think it's very important to understand sort of like where you're starting and where you need to be, and if you need help to do that to get it, because you talked about the False Claims Act earlier, and it does. And again, this is my opinion, but it does seem to me that the DoD is trending towards leveraging the False Claims Act against folks who are sort of wantonly, mishandling CUI and creating spillage because of their negligence. So I don't think that people should be scared, and I don't mean it like that at all. I mean it for the people who are really, who are sending things unencryptedly, or not even just sending it through an unencrypted line, but are saying, hey, I'm going to take the CUI label off of this and then send it over to unencrypted line. It's that sort of, like wanton endangerment of CUI that I think will come back to folks.
Yeah, and I think one of the comments that was made too was about making sure that the people within your organization, I believe that was a point I think you were making, Wilson, that they're doing what they should be doing to ensure that the controls that you put in place and the policies that you put in place are being followed. And certainly that's one of the things that a lot of our customers deal with every day. But one of the advantages of leveraging some type of tool or platform, which I would encourage people to think about as well, is the ability to be able to roll up the state of your controls into some dashboards, and to be able to see, based on either the lack of some evidence to support that the control is being followed properly, or something that's not operating correctly in the business, having some visibility so that you can understand I guess more broadly, the risks in your business, and then if some of those controls are failing, how that, what that implication is on the overall risk for your business. So, I think that's another consideration to think about here.
Peter, we are starting to see a little bit of a shift in perception as well. I can tell you, we've got a number of customers who have gotten over the hump of we have to do this because it's the right thing to do. And they're now looking at this as a business differentiator, right? This is a revenue gating requirement. So companies need to shift their perception from, this is something we have to do. Fine, let's just do it. How can we do it cheap and tick the box? You have to shift that perception to, this is a business differentiator to put you above your competitors. You're going to need to do it anyway, simply to, as a contract gate for much of your existing business. But if you can get there first, it's a leg up. And we're starting to see that shift in perception, which I think is, it's helpful. These are all the right things to do. Let's do them in the right spirit.
Great. Yeah, no, certainly true. I think, I guess one of the backdrop of all this, the real point is, are we building a safe and trustworthy and secure business? And let's not forget what we're really doing this for. These are important requirements and the like, and there's teeth in them, but it's also about making sure that your business is running well and that you are safeguarding information. I'm going to move on to my next question for the panel, which is, what other things should companies, or other considerations should companies be thinking about beyond what we've talked about relative to CMMC 2.0 in this realm? And I'll start with you, Kate, if you want to jump in on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that beyond this, and the first thing would be to, beyond CMMC is to look at DFARS, but we've talked about that. I think the next thing would be that an organization should consider their cybersecurity program holistically. And part of that's your budget, right? So we're nearing the end of the year, budgets are being finalized, and I hope that every organization is seriously considering their resources dedicated to cybersecurity. What that costs will be different to everyone depending on your size. So some organizations have the resources to hire someone in-house, to buy automated tools, to have teams dedicated to cybersecurity, but others don't. So some may need to outsource that expertise, maybe through a vCISO, a managed SOC, another avenue. But either way, organizations should be thinking about their unique needs and how they should be budgeting and utilizing their monetary and human resources towards cybersecurity. So we've all seen in the news the hacks on the Colonial Pipeline and SolarWinds and others. And doing what's reasonably prudent to ensure that your organization does not end up in that situation is paramount to the longevity of your organization. And frankly, your contracts with DoD or other executive agencies, because hacks can affect your bottom line because of data loss and downtime the exact same way it can through a tarnished reputation. So I think that's very important to remember, and something beyond CMMC to look at is your basic cyber hygiene. For anything that's internet facing, do you have MFA on it? Are you using an encrypted line to send, your highest priority data? Those types of things I think are really, really important to think about and to budget for over the long term.
Great. Wilson, how about yourself on this question?
So Jeff said it in the previous question before. Beyond CMMC, this is the right thing to do, right? We want to make sure that we're doing right by the organization by making sure that we invest budget-wise into the proper tools and the proper resources in order to be secure, but also to generate revenue, right? One of the things that I brought up to this group before is that now SPRS is becoming go, no-go with suppliers, right? Primes are starting to drop suppliers who don't have SPRS scores in the system, which, that impacts your bottom line. One of my clients gained three purchase orders because the suppliers didn't have their SPRS score in. by the due date, right? So it could be a blessing for you, or if you don't have it in, you're going to possibly get dropped. The other thing is that having cybersecurity also, it's a risk appetite thing for companies that are not government related at all, right? If you're able to say, hey, yeah, we have all of our policies, we have all of our procedures that are beyond CMMC 2.0, and we could show you by answering your risk questionnaires, we're able to show you that we're less risky to deal with. So beyond CMMC 2.0, we're seeing that this cybersecurity stuff, your system, is going to impact your bottom line, because companies are now more in tune to look at the risk that your organization poses on them.
Great. One question that came in from our audience, it's a little bit related to this, but is there any indication that the DoD or other U.S. government entities, that the CMMC standard is being considered as a cybersecurity standard outside just the defense industrial base? I know there's been a lot of talk about that in the past with Homeland Security and others. Is there any further clarity on that, or is that still unknown?
Yeah, I think that's still unknown. I think everything we're seeing is a significant amount of speculation, but as often happens, you will get the guidance and the policy tested on the defense industrial base and then potentially embraced at some lower levels across all of industry. But to bring it back to, Wilson's point, if we dig into what does this actually mean, it is simply doing all the right things. It's encrypting your data. It's implementing multi-factor authentication. It's ensuring removal of administrative access across your environment, except where absolutely required. So regardless of which segment you're in, I think it's a valid question to wonder whether or not at some point this may be mandated, but it is simply the common sense approach to take to protect your data, whether you have to do it or not. And, we talk about the carrot and the stick, and we prefer the carrot of you're going to be in great shape, do it because it's the right thing to do, and not the stick of, oh no, you've been breached and you've lost your data and your reputation. So it transitions into that. This is not necessarily an IT problem. This is a business problem, right? The business has to decide, does it want to be competitive and does it want to play in the space where these requirements are, again, I keep using the word, a differentiator. It may be, if you do it the right way, it may not be a massive one-time investment. Companies now have an opportunity over the next number of years to scale that increase in investment appropriately with their requirements. So I think it's a great question, Peter, and I do think it remains to be seen if this will cascade outside the defense industrial base. I don't know if Kate or Wilson have any thoughts on that.
I do, yeah. So it's the standard federally through 32 CFR Part 202 that if you are handling CUI, that you must use NIST 800-171 to protect it. So that's not just true for the Department of Defense. It's true for the Department of Energy, for labor, for the education, for every other department there is. So if you're a government contractor and you hold data of another executive agency or the federal government, you're already expected to be level 2. So the only difference really that DoD is saying is that they want an enforcement mechanism. That enforcement mechanism is, if you're holding CUI that DoD now determines to be higher risk than other types of CUI, and how they're going to determine that, I don't know. Then I'm going to come on site and I'm going to evaluate you against the framework. The only thing we haven't seen is other executive level agencies saying, we're going to enforce this. So from, just a framework, I'm protecting, this is how I'm setting up my IT environment to protect CUI. This is already the standard for every other executive level agency out there. The only difference really with CUI is how are you going to prove what you say you're doing?
Yeah, and I think that this is a start, right? We all are starting somewhere, and maybe the DoD is the guinea pig at the moment. But I foresee this being across the board later on, maybe not in the next 5 years, but maybe in 10 years when, CMMC, hopefully not like 10.0 comes out. But the thing is that we're heading in the right direction, which is good. And I think that bodes well for all of us that care about taking care of our country.
Great. I'm gonna move on to our last, sort of my last question, and then there's still a handful of questions we're gonna get to here. But the question I have is, what advice would you give companies to address the requirements of the government, your customers, and just more generally security posture? I know we've covered a lot of these topics, but just sort of what sort of final advice would you give? And I'll start with you, Kate. What advice would you give?
So we went over this a little bit earlier, but this offers a good opportunity to get a little bit more in depth about it. And I think that one of the most important things an organization can do, like we talked about earlier, is to be honest with themselves about what they can handle and what they have the bandwidth to manage. So I think that every organization should feel empowered to manage their own compliance programs. I do believe that when I engage with a client, I hope to educate them enough on how to manage their programs themselves, that if I win the lottery tomorrow, they know how to keep it going at least a little bit. And for some organizations, I want to teach them completely how to do it. They've got the bandwidth, they can figure it out. I'm there to help them. And then there are some organizations that don't have that ability. They don't have the ability to have multiple, resources in-house, working on their compliance programs all year long. So like I said earlier, this is my day job. So I spend 40 to 50 hours a week managing SSPs, POAMs, options for remediation, CUI programs, vetting vendors and solutions. I don't do the hands-on keyboard network infrastructure management or, technically implementing remediations or help desk or any of that. So, that work could take 2 more people that are 40 to 50 hours that are, dedicated. If you have an existing day job, it's really hard to do this at the same time. So in admitting that you need to seek out some experience help for your compliance program, I think is great. And like I said, it takes 100% of my working life to stay on top of these regulations. So for folks that have other things to do than CMMC, which I think is most people, it's probably everybody that's on this webinar probably has something better to do than CMMC, then that can become really burdensome. So if you do need external help, my advice to you are 2 things. So the very first thing I want you to ask someone you're considering to be your consultant is, have you heard of NIST 800-171A, the assessment guide for NIST 800-171? If they say maybe, no, or I am unsure, I want you to run and not walk away from them. They're not for you. They will not help you build a compliant NIST program. And again, that's NIST 800-171A. Write it down. And if your consultant doesn't know what it is inside and out, do not give them your money. The second thing I would say is to ask for references. So you want to find a firm that has experience with your size and your industry. I don't think that years are as vital as number of projects. So I would look for a firm that works with many clients all year long than a client that has one defense industrial-based client a year. You really want a firm that lives and breathes in this space all the time.
Great, Kate. What about you, Jeff?
Yeah, once again, Peter, we are all in violent agreement. I mean, there's a lot of companies that do this work. It's important to make sure that if you need help, you are getting the appropriate pedigree that comes along with that help. I agree with all of Kate's points. We typically tell people to, it's one thing to, let me give you an example, right, from the aerospace years, and it's the reason that my business partner and I started this adventure. When you're hiring someone to help you, you probably want someone who's managed these programs and actually sat across the table from the primes going through these audits and actually have the experience as the advocate of the company, being on the other side, demonstrating compliance. I think having that background working in the field is not absolutely mandatory, but it's something you should look for. Dealing with someone who's been there and done that and got the bruises is, I think, incredibly valid. Anybody can study the regs. Anybody can learn what they mean. It's not that difficult. But knowing what the reg means and standing up against a Lockheed audit and, being able to explain and understand why the way you've implemented a control is actually effective, that's invaluable experience. So to Kate's point, vet your folks and don't be scared to get the right help. The other bit that comes along with that, though, is a potentially uncomfortable conversation at the C-level or the board to help them understand that just like some frameworks like ISO 27001, everybody understands if you want to achieve that certification, it's an ongoing effort to maintain it, and it may require some headcount, and it may require some tools to manage. This is exactly the same thing. If you want to do it right, you are going to have to select an operational compliance management tool to help you to do it more effectively, and frankly, to lift some of the burden of needing to manage it in-house. So the right partner and the right tool, I think, is critical, but this is going to require a level of investment, and that's an important discussion to bring to that C-level. You may not be investing in this now. The only way to make it through it successfully is going to be with some investment, either in tools or people or a combination thereof.
Great, thanks. Wilson, you want to bring us home? And then we've got a few more questions that I think we have 4 right now, more questions I'd like to get to in the remaining time.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So back to the partner, and a lot of us haven't been through an 800. A lot of people may have not been through an 800-171 audit, or any kind of audit. So it's like, what kind of partner are you looking for? And we talk about bumps and bruises. One of the things that I know that's helped me get through plenty of audits is going through like the SIPR risk management framework audit. And if you're looking for somebody with that kind of, with experience, if they put RMF or risk management framework and they say that, they could possibly understand what in the heck is going to happen, because they understand the NIST 853. So just to put that on your radar when it comes to selecting a partner. So so the other part is how do you plan to show CMMC compliance? And just to make it quick, and this is just from my point of view, from being in the Marines for so many years, is really documentation, right? If you have a logbook and you could say that Johnny at 5 o'clock patched these systems, and you could show that it's consistent and it aligns with your procedures and your policy, I guarantee you're probably going to pass that control. So having the documentation ready and available for the assessors, and having it maintained and improved, reviewed year after year, is going to help you when that self-attestation comes. You're able to say that confidently, yes, I'm doing this. But also, if you have that audit that's going to come every 3 years, you're able to say, yes, I do this, and you're able to show that. And then also is not to look at your cybersecurity program as like just vertically as from the domain's perspective. I like to tell people this. I look at everything holistically. We need to develop a system. How does your vulnerability management, your access control program, how does that all fit together? And what does that mean to an organization? How does that impact my risk to my systems, to my clients, to the overall organizational risk management program? So those are some of the things that I would consider in how you can show your CMMC compliant beyond what we've been talking about today.
Great. Okay, we're going to do rapid fire questions. We have 4 questions, and let's say we have 5 minutes. So the first one, and I'll try to read them quickly. On the recent town hall, the DoD said that they will institute changes to the CMMC program and requirements by making changes via the NIST standard change process itself. Do you guys have any predictions about those? What these final changes might be?
So I do know that the federal rulemaking process is both simple and not simple, right? So when they create a rule, it goes through comment, and then you get to comment on the rule, and then they have to publish the final rule. There's another comment phase, and then they have to send it to the Federal Register. And so the Federal Register through NARA says that they really only need about 3 days from the time an agency gives them a rule until they can publish it. So it sounds in your head, when you say that, like, okay, so, they create it and then it's 60 to 90 days for comment. And then they create it again, another 60 to 90 days, and then just 3 days. And look at that, in 6 months, we have a rule. But really, the rulemaking process takes between 9 and 24 months, which means that we won't see the final rule for CMMC for another 9 to 24 months. And if you are familiar with this process, you will probably think to yourself, it's probably gonna be 25 months. So I'm not privy to any of the changes that could happen. But like I said earlier, NIST 800-171 is the federal standard. So if anything changes, it will be in addition to that. It can't be that something, has been taken away from that. So focus on NIST 800-171, get compliant with that, and you'll be in good shape.
Okay, great. I'm going to go on to the next question again in the interest of time. Also, do you trust your OEM? Look at what just happened at Zoom. Any comments on that? I guess the question is, do you trust your OEM? Anybody have any observation there?
How long do you have, Peter? Yes, great question. But it's valid, right? So as a small to medium company, you are not going to be capable of delivering all the services that you require internally. You're going to have to rely on some third parties. You're going to have to rely on some trusted partners. Selecting the trusted partner and the solution set is very important. A great example comes back to Kate's point around Microsoft's GCC offerings, where out of the box, you move your core services to Microsoft Secured Cloud, and you're going to be about 78% compliant from the get-go without tweaking any additional controls. So it is possible to lean on trusted partners that will do a lot of the work. But using the Zoom breach as an example, again, it simply reinforces that companies have to practice what they preach. Right? That's an example of, again, we could go down the rabbit hole of who's not doing what they say they're doing. And frankly, that's another example of a breach in controls that could likely have been prevented with the appropriate attention to regulatory detail.
Great. I'm going to go to the next question. Again, we're on rapid fire. As a smaller size company with no IT staff or IT security staff, how do I know where to start with these controls? What's my first step? Who wants to give us some advice on that?
Well, I'll go ahead.
Okay, Wilson, go for it.
So, it goes back to finding that trusted partner, right? You have to do your due diligence and find a trusted partner that can at least answer the question, do you know what the 800-171 is and how it's applicable to me as a small business? I think that's one of the things that you should start with. There are plenty of companies that are out there. But the companies that are listed here, like that, we all do the same thing. We know how to assess, do gap analysis, and provide recommendations to implementation. So those are probably the first steps that I would do. And then if you can help us out by getting an inventory of all your systems and making sure that you understand the software and any kind of third-party software that you have. And in seeing if they have any kind of DFARS attestations on any of those platforms, and that should be able to help you out when the assessor does come. Sorry, your help does come, so they could develop your SSP and your POAM accordingly.
Great. And final question: how much does CMMC 2.0 achievement protect from ransomware attacks? Who wants to grab that one?
Well, I'll take the nerd question. Being the IT nerd from the way back days, if you've implemented all of the controls stipulated by CMMC 2.0, and if you've implemented them effectively, you cannot care about ransomware. You will have a robust backup policy. You'll implement it and you'll test it successfully to the point that, oh no, we had a ransomware. Oh, well, let's just restore the data from 2 hours ago. It effectively, and I'm not going to say it eliminates that risk, because there are lots of companies that fall into the trap of not testing their backups, even though they think they're working. But if you've effectively implemented the controls, it protects you entirely from a ransomware attack.
Great. With that, I think we're gonna wrap. I want to thank our panelists here for their insights, and appreciate your time and expertise. Also want to thank the audience for attending. Thank you for spending time with us today. You will receive an email that has the recording and the slides from today, although there was I think we only showed one slide and then this last one, but you will get both of those. And one, and if you are interested, we talked a little bit about tooling for how you can sort of get on top of this from a technology standpoint. We're happy to, on the hyperproof side, provide a demonstration of how to support 800.171 and CMMC level 2. How you can stand that up within the hyperproof platform. You can go to our website. There's a link, or you can go here where you can book a demo for that. So with that, I'm going to I'd like to thank Jeff, Kate, and Wilson. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And thank you, the audience, and have a great day.
Cheers, all.